Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to remain silent. We live in a world that constantly encourages us to speak, to voice our opinions, to make noise. The louder we are, the more we seem to be heard, the more we feel like we matter. But in the midst of all this noise, there is a voice, quiet, gentle, yet profound, that tells us that sometimes the best thing we can do is keep our mouths shut. God, in his wisdom, knows that our mouths have the power to shape our lives, to change our destinies, to bring life or death. And in his infinite grace, he sometimes asks us to pause, to listen, and to keep our mouth shut. We must understand that our words are not just sounds that echo into the air. Our words are seeds planted into the soil of our lives, our relationships, our careers, and our futures. What we say has the potential to either nourish or destroy. Our words can either build bridges or create walls. They can either bring healing or inflict pain. That is why there are times when God says, "Be still, don't speak. Wait for the right moment." We are often quick to speak when we feel misunderstood, when we want to defend ourselves, or when we are hurt. But God, in his perfect understanding of our human nature, knows that when we open our mouths out of frustration, anger, or fear, we risk speaking words that we may later regret. The Bible tells us in Proverbs 18:21 that death and life are in the power of the tongue. What we speak can build or destroy, can bring life or bring death. So God, in his infinite wisdom, sometimes says to us, hold your tongue. He knows that what we say can have long-lasting effects, and he wants us to be careful with our words. Sometimes we need to keep silent because the battle isn't ours to fight. We want to take matters into our own hands. We want to defend ourselves, to prove that we are right, to show everyone that we are not weak. But there are moments when God wants us to trust in his ability to fight on our behalf. He wants us to rely on his wisdom and strength, not our own. He says in Exodus 14:14, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." When we choose silence, we are acknowledging that God is in control. We are trusting that he will fight for us, that he will vindicate us, that he will bring justice in his time. Silence is not always a sign of weakness. In fact, it can be a sign of strength. The world may not understand why we choose to keep quiet in the face of adversity, but God knows that silence is a form of trust. It is a way of saying, I trust you, God. I trust that you know what is best. I trust that you are working even when I cannot see it. When we choose silence, we are surrendering our desire to control and allowing God to do what only he can do. We are also told in Scripture that there are times when silence is necessary for our growth. Sometimes we speak because we are afraid of being overlooked, of being forgotten. We feel that if we don't assert ourselves, we will be invisible. But God tells us that he sees us even in our silence. He hears us even when we don't speak. He knows the desires of our hearts, and he will bring them to pass in his time. Psalm 139:1-2 says, O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. God knows us better than we know ourselves. He knows our needs, our desires, and our struggles, even before we utter a word. In our fast-paced world, we often feel the pressure to speak quickly, to respond immediately, to have something to say. But God invites us to take a moment and listen. Listening requires humility. It requires the ability to pause, to reflect, and to allow God to speak before we respond. There are moments when we want to speak, but God is asking us to listen first. In James 1:19, we are reminded, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. There is wisdom in listening. There is power in silence. When we take the time to listen, We allow God to speak to our hearts, to guide our steps, and to give us the wisdom we need to speak at the right moment. But there's another reason why God sometimes asks us to keep our mouths shut, and that is to protect us. There are times when we speak too quickly, too impulsively, and we end up revealing things that should remain hidden. Our words can expose our vulnerabilities, our fears, and our insecurities. But God, in his love for us, sometimes asks us to hold our tongues because he knows that there are certain things that need to stay between him and us. He knows that there are some things that are not meant to be shared with everyone. Silence, in this case, becomes a shield. It protects us from unnecessary scrutiny, from gossip, and from the judgment of others. In Matthew 7:6, Jesus warns us, "Do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you." There are moments in life when our words are precious, when our thoughts are sacred, and we must guard them with care. Not everyone is ready to receive the wisdom that God has placed within us. Not everyone will appreciate the depth of the lessons we have learned. And so there are times when God asks us to remain silent, not because our words are not valuable, but because they are too precious to be wasted on those who are not ready to understand. Silence also has a way of humbling us. It teaches us to control our impulses, to think before we speak, to be intentional with our words. In Proverbs 17:27-28, we read, "Whoever restrains his words has knowledge, and he who has a cool spirit is a man of understanding. Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent." There is power in restraint. There is strength in holding our peace. And when we choose silence, we are demonstrating a maturity that is not easily shaken by the opinions of others or by the circumstances around us. In the life of Jesus, we see the perfect example of this. When he was arrested, when he was falsely accused, when he was mocked and beaten, he chose silence. In Matthew 27:12-14, it says, "But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate said to him, 'Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?' But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed." Jesus, the Son of God, remained silent in the face of injustice, knowing that his silence was part of God's greater plan. He trusted his Father's will, and he allowed his actions to speak louder than his words. There are times in our lives when we must follow that example. When we are falsely accused, when we are misunderstood, when we are rejected or betrayed, we must remember that silence can be a form of surrender. It is an acknowledgement that God is in control, that he knows the truth, and that he will fight for us. We don't always need to defend ourselves. God will defend us. We don't always need to prove our worth. God knows our value. As we navigate through life, there will be many moments when God asks us to be quiet. In those moments, we must learn to trust him, to lean on his wisdom, and to wait for his timing. Our words have the power to build or to destroy, and there are times when God calls us to keep our mouths shut, not because we have nothing to say, but because he has something better to say. When we learn to listen to God, to trust his timing, and to be silent when he asks, we open ourselves up to his greater plan for our lives. Silence becomes an act of faith, a sign that we are fully surrendered to his will and trusting him to work things out in his perfect time. Our words have the potential to create or destroy. At times, silence is a powerful choice that allows us to avoid regret and harm, trusting that God's wisdom will guide our actions more than our impulsive responses. In moments of struggle or misunderstanding, God may call us to keep quiet, teaching us to trust in his perfect timing and his ability to fight battles on our behalf. Silence is a way of surrendering control and allowing God to handle what we cannot. Silence serves as both a shield and a tool for personal growth. By holding our tongues, we protect ourselves from unnecessary conflict and maintain the integrity of our words, all while cultivating wisdom, maturity, and trust in God's guidance. There is a remarkable power in silence that many fail to recognize in the chaos of life's demands and pressures. In a world constantly encouraging expression and voice, where every thought seems to need an outlet, silence stands as an often overlooked tool. Yet silence is not a mere absence of sound or noise. It holds the potential to shape our lives, define our character, and influence our relationships and spiritual journey. The power of silence is not passive. It is active, transformative, and often one of the most profound choices we can make. It may seem counterintuitive in a world where noise equates to visibility and attention, but silence, when used rightly, can speak volumes in ways words often cannot. The first power of silence is its ability to create space for introspection. In a world where we are constantly bombarded with external noise, whether through media, conversations, or the demands of daily life, it is easy to lose touch with our inner selves. Silence provides a refuge, a sacred space where we can withdraw from the chaos and listen to the still, quiet voice of our own hearts. It is in this quiet that we can reflect on our thoughts, our emotions, and our motivations. We are given the opportunity to analyze what is truly important to us and align our actions with our values. Silence allows us to take a step back from the demands of others and, instead, turn inward to understand our true selves. It is in these moments of stillness that we can find clarity, where the noise of the world fades into the background, and we can hear the whisper of wisdom that often gets drowned out in the hustle and bustle of life. In the same way, silence has the power to foster deep and meaningful connection with God. Our world is often too loud, filled with distractions and busyness, that it becomes difficult to hear God's voice. But silence has a way of clearing the noise, creating space for divine communication. When we choose silence, we are making room for God to speak to us. It is in these moments of quiet reflection and stillness that we open ourselves to hearing God's guidance, comfort, and direction. We often rush through our prayers and rush through life, but silence invites us to wait upon God, to listen before we speak, and to trust that He is always speaking, even when we cannot hear Him clearly. Silence is a form of surrender, where we let go of our own desires and distractions and allow God to move in our hearts. It is a sacred act that deepens our relationship with God as we cultivate a space where His presence can dwell and His voice can be heard. Silence is also a powerful tool in relationships. In the heat of conflict or emotional turmoil, it is easy to react impulsively, to speak out of frustration or pain. But silence in such moments can prevent us from saying things we may later regret. It is often in the heat of the moment, when emotions are raw and tempers are high, that we are most prone to speaking words that hurt or damage relationships. Yet, by choosing to remain silent, we give ourselves time to process, to calm down, and to think carefully before responding. Silence allows us to regain composure and to choose our words wisely. It gives us the space to consider the feelings of others and to avoid unnecessary escalation. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do in a relationship is not speak, but to listen. Listen to the other person's heart. Listen to the situation and listen to what God might be saying about how to respond. There is also a profound healing power in silence. Often, when we are hurt or wounded, we feel the need to vocalize our pain, to express our emotions, and to let others know what we are going through. While this is natural, there is healing that can come from holding our pain in the silence of God's presence. Silence can be a space where we bring our hurts, our fears, and our struggles before God, without the need to explain or justify them. In the stillness, We can experience God's comfort and healing in a deeper way. Silence gives us the opportunity to sit with our emotions without being rushed to resolve them. It allows us to process the depth of our pain or disappointment, and in doing so, it becomes a space where God's healing balm can soothe our broken hearts. When we sit in silence before God, He can mend what is broken, restore what is lost, and bring peace to the chaos within us. Silence, in its essence, is a form of restraint. It teaches us the discipline of controlling our impulses and responses. We live in a society where instant reactions are encouraged. If we feel something, we are told to express it immediately. If we have an opinion, we are urged to voice it without hesitation. But silence requires a different approach. It requires patience and self-restraint. In moments of frustration or anger, when we are tempted to lash out, silence asks us to pause, to breathe, and to allow our emotions to settle before responding. In this way, silence becomes a powerful practice of emotional regulation. It teaches us to slow down and think before we speak. It calls us to recognize that not every thought or feeling needs to be expressed immediately. Sometimes the best response is the one that is measured, intentional, and well considered. Silence is a practice of maturity where we learn to hold back, not because we have nothing to say, but because we know the value of saying the right thing at the right time. Furthermore, silence has the power to protect us. In our world, it is all too easy to overshare, to reveal too much of ourselves to others. But there are things within us that are sacred that need to remain hidden in the secret place with God. Our thoughts, our struggles, our dreams, some things are meant to be kept in the silence of our hearts until the right time for them to be shared. Silence can act as a shield, protecting us from unnecessary exposure or vulnerability. There are moments when our words are too precious to be spoken to the wrong people or in the wrong context. Silence helps us guard our hearts and our thoughts, allowing us to discern when it is wise to speak and when it is better to remain quiet. It is in silence that we learn the art of discretion and wisdom, knowing that not every thought or feeling needs to be voiced. In the right moments, silence protects us from judgment, gossip, and the prying eyes of others. It is a reminder that not all things are meant to be revealed at once, and that there is beauty in keeping some things hidden in the quiet places. Silence also holds the power to build strength within us. In the stillness, we are forced to confront our fears, our insecurities, and our doubts. There is no distraction to divert our attention. Silence strips away the noise of the world and forces us to face what is inside. In those moments of discomfort, when we feel vulnerable or unsettled, silence becomes a tool for personal growth. It is in the silence that we can wrestle with our fears and doubts, where we can confront the things that hold us back from becoming the people we are meant to be. As we sit in silence, we begin to grow in strength, resilience, and understanding. We learn to become comfortable in the discomfort, knowing that silence is not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. It is in these moments of stillness that we discover our true strength, as we allow God to shape and refine us into who we are meant to become. Finally, silence has a unique ability to amplify the power of our words when we do choose to speak. When we have learned to embrace silence, we begin to understand the weight and significance of our words. Our speech becomes more intentional, more thoughtful, and more impactful. The moments when we do speak are filled with purpose and meaning. Silence teaches us the value of timing, knowing when to hold our tongues and when to speak out. Words that are born out of silence are often words that carry more weight, words that have been carefully considered and chosen. In this way, silence is not the absence of communication, but a means of making our words more powerful. By mastering the art of silence, we become better communicators, knowing how to speak at the right time and in the right way. Trusting God's timing is one of the most important and difficult aspects of living a life of faith. We live in a world that is driven by urgency, where everything must be done now, and patience is often seen as a sign of weakness or a lack of ambition. But God's ways are different. His timing is perfect, and it does not operate according to the clock or calendar that we follow. It can be a challenge to trust in God's timing, especially when our desires, dreams, or prayers seem to go unanswered for long periods. Yet the truth is that trusting God's timing is essential for our spiritual growth, peace, and ultimate fulfillment in life. The foundation of trusting God's timing lies in understanding that He is sovereign and has a greater perspective than we could ever have. We see only part of the picture, while God sees the whole story. He knows what is best for us, even when we do not. Often, we pray and ask God for something, and we expect an immediate response. We may feel that what we are asking for is urgent, and we want to see change in our lives right away. However, God in His wisdom knows when the right time is. His timing is never late, and it is never too early. It is always just right. When we face delays or unanswered prayers, we may feel frustrated or discouraged. We may begin to question whether God is listening or whether He is truly for us. But the reality is that God's silence is not a reflection of His absence or His disinterest in our lives. It is often part of His greater plan for us. We need to remember that God's timing is not based on our immediate wants or desires. It is based on His infinite wisdom, love, and understanding of what is best for us in the long term. God's timing is perfect because He sees not only the outcome we desire, but also the process we need to go through to become the person He has called us to be. In the Bible, we see numerous examples of individuals who had to trust God's timing even when it seemed like God was taking too long to act. One such example is the story of Abraham and Sarah. God promised Abraham that he would become the father of many nations. Yet for many years, Abraham and Sarah had no children. They waited for a long time, and as the years passed, they began to doubt whether God's promise would ever come to fruition. Eventually, Sarah, in her desperation, suggested that Abraham have a child with her servant Hagar. But this plan was not part of God's timing, and it led to complications and heartache. Only when Sarah was well beyond the age of bearing children did God fulfill His promise, and Isaac was born. It was in God's perfect timing, when it seemed impossible, that Abraham and Sarah's faith was tested and proven. Their story reminds us that God's timing is not dictated by our circumstances or understanding. It is determined by His purpose for our lives. Another powerful example of trusting God's timing can be seen in the life of David. As a young shepherd boy, David was anointed by the prophet Samuel to be the future king of Israel. However, despite this divine anointing, David did not immediately become king. Instead, he spent many years fleeing from King Saul, who was jealous of David's anointing and sought to kill him. During this time, David could have become bitter, angry, or impatient, but he trusted in God's timing. David waited on God's timing to fulfill His promise, and in the end, God established David as king in His perfect time. David's story teaches us that even when we are promised great things, we must still wait for God's timing to bring them to pass. It is in the waiting that we are refined, strengthened, and prepared for the purpose that God has for us. There are also times when God's timing appears to conflict with our own. We may pray for a specific outcome, but the result seems delayed, or it may not look like what we expected. We want things to happen in a certain way, and we believe that we know the best course of action. Yet, God's ways are higher than our ways. In Isaiah 55:8-9, God reminds us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." When we trust God's timing, we acknowledge that His plans for us are far greater than our own, even when we cannot fully understand them in the moment. One of the reasons it is so difficult to trust God's timing is because we often equate waiting with a sense of inactivity or stagnation. In our human minds, waiting feels like wasted time, and we may begin to feel frustrated or anxious. However, waiting on God is not passive. It is an active process. Waiting is a time of preparation. God often uses seasons of waiting to refine us, to build our character, and to teach us lessons that will equip us for the future. Waiting is an opportunity to grow in patience, perseverance, and trust. It is in these waiting seasons that we can develop a deeper relationship with God, learning to lean on Him and trust His heart for us, even when we do not see the full picture. Waiting on God also teaches us to rely on His strength rather than our own. We live in a culture that prizes self-sufficiency, and we are often tempted to take matters into our own hands when things don't go according to our plan. But when we trust in God's timing, we surrender our own plans and trust that He will provide what we need at the right moment. As we wait, we are learning to depend on God's provision and guidance. It is during these moments of waiting that our faith is strengthened as we learn to trust that God knows what is best for us. Another aspect of trusting God's timing is learning to recognize that His delays are not denials. Just because something has not happened yet does not mean that it will never happen. In fact, God's delays often serve to prepare us for what is to come. When we are in a season of waiting, we may feel that our prayers have gone unanswered. But God is always working behind the scenes, aligning circumstances and preparing us for the fulfillment of His promises. Sometimes the delay is not because God is withholding something from us, but because He is setting the stage for something greater than we could ever imagine. It is in the waiting that our hearts are prepared to receive what God has for us. One of the most beautiful aspects of trusting in God's timing is the peace it brings. When we learn to surrender our desires and plans to God, we are freed from the pressure of trying to control the outcome. We can rest in the knowledge that God is in control and that His timing is perfect. We do not need to worry about when or how things will happen because we trust that God is working everything out for our good. As we surrender to His timing, we experience peace that transcends our understanding. In Philippians 4:6-7, we are told, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Trusting in God's timing brings peace, knowing that He is always working in our best interests, even when we cannot see the full picture. Learning to trust God's timing is an ongoing process, one that requires patience, perseverance, and a willingness to surrender control. It is not easy, and there will be moments when we feel impatient, frustrated, or discouraged. But in those moments, we can take comfort in the knowledge that God is faithful. He is always working behind the scenes, preparing us for what is to come. As we trust in His perfect timing, we grow in faith, character, and hope. We begin to see that His timing is not something to be feared or resisted, but something to be embraced. God's timing is a reflection of His love and care for us. And when we trust in it, we experience the peace and joy that comes from knowing that He is always working for our good. There is an undeniable power in restraint, a concept that often contradicts the natural human inclination to express ourselves freely and immediately. In a world that celebrates quick reactions, spontaneous decisions, and speaking our minds without much thought, restraint can seem counterintuitive. Yet through the practice of self-restraint, we not only protect ourselves from harm, but also allow room for growth and development. This paradoxical truth that restraint can lead to greater protection and personal growth holds a deep and transformative power that we often overlook in the rush of daily life. At its core, restraint is not about suppressing or stifling our emotions, desires, or reactions, but rather about choosing to exercise wisdom in how and when we express them. Restraint is an act of self-control, where we pause, reflect, and make conscious decisions instead of reacting impulsively. It is an act of strength and maturity, a recognition that there is power in choosing not to say or do something in a given moment. Restraint requires a level of emotional intelligence and trust. Trust in ourselves, in others, and in a higher purpose or greater wisdom that guides our decisions. The first way that restraint protects us is by preventing unnecessary harm in our relationships. How often do we speak or act in moments of anger or frustration, only to regret our words and actions later? Words once spoken cannot be taken back, and they have the power to cause deep wounds. Restraint gives us the opportunity to step back in those moments of intense emotion and avoid saying something that might hurt another person. It is in these moments that we must remind ourselves that it is better to say nothing than to say something that will damage a relationship irreparably. Restraint doesn't mean suppressing our feelings, but rather choosing the right moment and manner to express them in a way that promotes understanding, healing, and connection. Through restraint, we allow time for our emotions to settle and for us to gain a clear perspective before reacting. In relationships, restraint also creates space for better communication. When we speak in the heat of the moment, we may not communicate clearly or effectively. In the chaos of emotions, we may misunderstand the intentions of others or misinterpret a situation. By exercising restraint and taking a moment to think before responding, we give ourselves the chance to process what has been said, to consider the other person's perspective, and to choose a more thoughtful, measured response. This space allows us to engage in conversations with a level of maturity and understanding that strengthens relationships instead of causing division. It is through this kind of restraint that trust and respect are built over time, as others see that we are thoughtful and intentional in how we communicate. Restraint also serves as protection for our own emotional well-being. In a society that often encourages venting or reacting to every perceived slight, we can easily find ourselves overwhelmed by negative emotions. If we allow every feeling of frustration, disappointment, or anger to dictate our actions, we risk living in a constant state of turmoil. Restraint offers us an opportunity to take a step back from our emotions and prevent ourselves from being controlled by them. In doing so, we preserve our inner peace and prevent the erosion of our emotional strength. Restraint allows us to acknowledge our feelings without allowing them to dictate our behavior. By not reacting impulsively, we maintain control over our emotions, and in turn, we protect ourselves from the chaos that unchecked emotions can bring. On a deeper level, restraint is also about guarding our hearts from unnecessary negativity and harm. There are times when we may feel compelled to share something, perhaps to defend ourselves, expose the wrongs done to us, or to seek validation. But not everything needs to be said, and not every situation needs to be addressed immediately. Choosing restraint in these situations is a way of protecting our hearts from becoming entangled in unnecessary drama, conflict, or negativity. We may want to speak out or retaliate when we feel slighted, but exercising restraint allows us to preserve our peace and avoid situations that could lead to further hurt. It is through this protection that we create space for positive, healthy relationships that are built on trust, mutual respect, and understanding. Beyond protection, restraint also nurtures growth in ways we might not initially recognize. Growth, especially personal and spiritual growth, often happens in moments of tension, waiting, and self-discipline. Restraint teaches us patience and endurance as we learn to delay gratification and wait for the right time to act or speak. This process can be uncomfortable, but it is precisely in these moments of discomfort that growth occurs. We are forced to confront our impulses, our desires, and our emotions, which, in turn, helps us develop greater self-restraint and emotional resilience. It is easy to act on impulse, but true strength lies in the ability to control our impulses and wait for a time when we can respond in a way that aligns with our values and goals. Restraint is also an essential component of wisdom. Wisdom is not about knowing everything. It is about knowing when and how to act. Restraint allows us to pause and reflect, giving us the opportunity to gain a broader perspective and make better decisions. Instead of rushing into situations or reacting out of habit, restraint allows us to think critically and evaluate the situation at hand. It is in these moments of restraint that we open ourselves up to God's guidance and wisdom. When we resist the urge to act or speak impulsively, we give room for clarity and understanding. We allow our minds to be sharp and focused, which helps us make decisions that are thoughtful and wise. Restraint, therefore, is not simply about holding back. It is about creating space for wisdom to grow and to guide our actions. Another significant way restraint fosters growth is through its role in developing our character. Character is built through the choices we make every day, especially the difficult ones. Restraining ourselves in moments of temptation, conflict, or frustration allows us to build a strong, resilient character. When we choose not to give in to the urge to lash out, gossip, or indulge in harmful behavior, we are exercising discipline and integrity. Character is forged in the moments when we choose to do the hard thing instead of the easy thing. It is in these moments that we prove to ourselves and others that we can be trusted, that we can be relied upon to act with honor and dignity. Restraint is not just about holding back from negative behaviors. It is about choosing to act in ways that reflect the values we want to uphold in our lives. Restraint is also a powerful tool in our spiritual growth. The Bible often speaks about the importance of self-control, and this is a key component of the fruit of the Spirit. In Galatians 5:22-23, we are told that self-control is a fruit of the Spirit, and it is something that God cultivates within us as we walk in obedience to Him. As we learn to exercise restraint in our thoughts, words, and actions, we allow God to shape us more into the image of Christ. Restraint helps us align our lives with God's will, as we learn to control our impulses and submit to His greater plan for our lives. Through restraint, we learn to trust God's timing and His guidance, allowing His Spirit to lead us in all things. In addition, restraint teaches us humility. Humility is the recognition that we do not have all the answers and that our way is not always the best way. When we practice restraint, we acknowledge that we do not need to have the last word, that we do not need to always be right, and that sometimes it is better to step back and listen rather than to speak. Restraint helps us understand that life is not about asserting our own will or proving ourselves to others. It is about serving and allowing others to share their thoughts and perspectives. Through restraint, we humble ourselves and open the door for greater understanding, peace, and unity in our relationships with others. Finally, restraint allows us to develop a deeper trust in God. It is in moments of restraint that we realize we cannot control everything. There are situations and outcomes that are beyond our ability to influence, and restraint teaches us to surrender to God's will. We trust that He is in control and that He knows what is best for us. Restraint, therefore, is an act of faith, a recognition that in waiting and in choosing to hold back, we trust God's timing and His sovereignty over our lives. The act of restraint, while initially difficult, leads to profound protection and growth. Through self-discipline, we protect ourselves from unnecessary conflict, harm, and emotional turmoil. And as we grow in our ability to exercise restraint, we experience a transformation within ourselves, one that makes us wiser, stronger, and more capable of facing the challenges of life with grace, patience, and integrity. Restraint, therefore, is not just about holding back. It is about moving forward into greater wisdom, strength, and spiritual maturity.